Finally, I was sitting in it, that I was just asking about what were you watching?
Okay. Hello, folks. Welcome to the first of our handful of fall 2025 architecture program lectures. We have a great slate of lectures, including today. I do want to acknowledge right at the start the Potomac Valley AIA and their efforts in working with us, the liaison between us and the National AIA to help provide continuing education credits. And so we are very thankful for their support. Another note I want to say is that ask all of the students here to jump on this QR code and sign in your attendance. There's a very short form for you to fill out attached to this QR code. It's a little bit of a different process this time, but I am confident that you will figure it out. Thank you for doing that. Just leave it up for one more second. Get that on your phone. We are so pleased to have Carl Elefante joining us. It's a very special event for us, not only because of Carl, who has recently published his book, Going for Zero, a book that's garnering acclaim. He's in the middle of would you call it a book tour? A mini book tour, right? He's spreading the word, and we're so glad that we're one of the pit stops here on his journey as he kind of discusses these important topics around decarbonization. So thank you, Carl, for being here. And we'll have an introduction in just a moment. But one of the reasons that this lecture in particular is quite special is that it is endowed by Smith Group. This is the Colden Florence Thomas Eichbaum lecture. It's an annually endowed lecture. We are so grateful to Smith Group for their support, not only in helping to bring Carl here, but also because there is a reception that follows this lecture. So if you'll all make your way to the great space afterward for food and drink, and most importantly, Carl will be there signing books. So bring your copy. And that's another touch point and an opportunity to engage with Carl there. So we're very grateful again to Smith Group for that. And in fact, I would like to invite Robert Bull, Vice President of Smith Group, here to the podium to tell us a little bit more about this endowment.
Thank you, Michael. Really happy to be here. All right. Love to talk a little bit about the legacy of Colden Florence and Tom Eichbaum, two great architects that I had the benefit of working with, but also many others across the Washington, D.C. area and across the region and across the country. They had a huge impact on the profession, and I think worthy of noting endowment for this lecture. The image that's up here right now, I think really is emblematic of Koch's career as a project he was hugely proud of. It's the American Cemetery Visitor Center at Normandy, France. It culminated a bunch of unique aspects about his career. One was the military service. He served in the military and came from a long legacy of veterans, but also great design and working with some of our most established and well-positioned institutions. So this was with the Veterans Administration. If you're ever in Normandy, France, this is definitely a project I would recommend visiting, and one that he and our firm are very proud of. The legacy of Koch and Tom Eichbaum goes way back. They were part of a really influential group of architects that found their way to Washington, D.C. after the Second World War, and really became instrumental in sort of defining the aesthetic of the city and its core in modernism. Some of the legacy projects that were really notable from that collaboration was the WMATA headquarters in downtown DC, several urban housing and renewal projects in Southwest DC. What else? Several of the projects sort of expand beyond the normal context too, including the U.S. Embassy in Lima, Peru, which was a pretty pivotal project for a small firm just starting out in the 50s. But then also a lot of infrastructure projects that are kind of behind the scenes, things that you may not normally notice. But the Pepco substation in Southwest DC is one of my favorites, and I think really, again, represents a great sort of modernist aesthetic in downtown DC. The history of the firm goes way back to 1951 with the beginning of Kai Smith, Satterley, and Lethbridge. There was several important partners within that original group. One was Clothiel Smith, who was one of the first female architects to get recognized as a fellow in the AIA. If you don't know anything about her, I would definitely recommend doing a little deeper dive to understand her legacy in the Washington community and the history and architecture. The nature of the firm evolved over several generations, with Koch Florence becoming a named partner in 1975, and then Tom Eishbaum becoming a named partner in 1985. That firm eventually evolved into KCF SHG in the late 90s that became part of Smith Group in 2000. And it was right around that time when I got to know Tom and Koch very well, and they became mentors of mine. Koch was enormously impactful. He has that wry smile. Anybody that knows him well knows that there's always a joke behind those eyes, just ready to come out, and something really, sometimes snarky, but often very witty. Again, he was really enormously impactful across the city. He's often referred to as the Dean of Architects. He had over 60 years in his career in Washington, D.C., with over 40 awards. Some of the most important ones was the conversion of the Pension Building into the National Building Museum. So a great example of adaptive renewal, converting a historical building to a new use that is still very viable today. The Washington National Cathedral Visitor Center, incredible project that sort of positioned a large parking garage below grade that really sort of transformed the entry and gateway sequence for the National Cathedral. And then a national AIA award-winning project for the National Postal Museum, again, an adaptive reuse project. And the project I mentioned before at Normandy, France, all projects that he was very proud of and really sort of established the core of his career. And then Tom Eishbaum, so those of you who may know, he was one of the first graduates, and I think he was in the first class of the University of Maryland School of Architecture, graduating in 1974. He then went on to get his master's degree at Harvard, but always his heart and the base of his architecture career was in Washington, D.C. So he returned shortly after that and became a partner in KCF with Tom in the mid 70s. One of the things that most people may know about Tom that knew him really well was he was a really active model maker. He really believed a lot in the physical qualities of a model and how important that was. That was a legacy that he inherited from his father, who was the chief model maker for Louis Kahn. So he grew up learning a lot about great design and great modern architecture directly from one of the greats in Philadelphia. And so some of the projects that he was well known for and very proud of was the University of Maryland Van Munchen Hall. He was among the first trained architects from the University of Maryland that designed and built a building on campus. And also he was very ahead of his time in sustainability and thinking about conservation in the environment. And he was instrumental at delivering the Chesapeake Bay Foundation Merrill Center, which was one of the first LEED Platinum buildings in the world. An example of the model here on the bottom is the Southeast Federal Center that he did, which was really instrumental in sort of reshaping this southeast quadrant of Washington, D.C. Now, if you go down there, this is where Nationals Park is. A lot of great development that you've seen over the last 10, 15, 20 years was really tied back to this master plan that Tom was instrumentally involved in, that translated directly for Smith Group into one of our great projects that we're very proud of. That's right there at DC Waters. It's right off the Anacostia River. So a great context for architecture, and I think translates very well to the conversation that we're going to have later today and hearing from Carl. Carl was a friend and peer of both Koch and Tom, so really looking forward to making that connection and honoring their legacy with this lecture.
Thank you so much, Robert. And we're quite grateful to Smith Group for all of their support. So we have a kind of new tradition here at the Architecture School that when we invite a guest to lecture, we also ask them to spend some time in our studios so that students have an additional touch point with that person and have an experience, a kind of learning experience with them. And that happened today as well. Carl joined Architecture 401 for a 90-minute workshop, and I heard that it was really productive and interesting. And I'd like to invite Michael Abrams, who's the coordinator of Architecture 401, to give a proper introduction to Carl here, and then we'll hear from Carl himself.
Thank you so much. So we have the wonderful time with Carl today in 401. He was able to speak with our Studio 2 students about adaptive reuse, since that's our first project we're working on in Studio in Art 401. And I want to read a brief introduction to Carl's biography. Known worldwide for coining the phrase, "the greenest building is the one that is already built." Carl Elefante is Principal Emeritus with Quinn Evans. In 2024, he was recipient of the AIA Firm Award, where he practiced architecture at the intersection of historic preservation and sustainable design. In 2018, Carl served as president of the AIA, the culmination of many leadership positions in architecture, historic preservation, and sustainable design organizations. Carl is a senior fellow with Architectural 2030 and a short-term member of the Climate Heritage Network. He's also a fellow of both the AIA and Association for Preservation Technology International. And most importantly, he is a TERP. He graduated from the program, Bachelor's of Architecture in 1980, and he's very proudly wearing his turtle. So please help me introduce and welcome Mr. Carl Elefante.
Oh, hopefully this microphone is on now. Sound that way?
Yes.
Great. Okay. And I'm just going to guess that I'm going to use the keys on the computer. So, hello everybody. I'm actually here. I'm present now. It's a real pleasure to be here. I can't tell you how much it means to me to be here in a room that I spent a lot of time in as a student. Seriously, it really warms my heart to be here. There's been a lot of water under the bridge since 1980, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. But I'm here basically because I just published a book, and a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today are really, literally themes in that book. Not everything, but a lot. I mentioned that just to say that, you know, we build things. That's what we do. And it's just an amazing thing for us to undertake. We literally shape the environment that everything that human beings do happens in. That's an incredibly enormous responsibility. I mean, it takes your breath away. We literally have the power of life and death over people in protecting their health, safety, and welfare. And, you know, it was mentioned in my introduction that I was president of AIA. I literally met thousands of architects all over the country, and in fact, even all over the world. And the thing that I discovered about them is that they're awesome people. They are people that get up in the morning because they're convinced that what they do is going to make the world a better place. And they go to bed at night really convinced that they did that day. How many people do you know who are motivated by something like that in their daily lives? Do you think we have enough people like that in our society? So for us to be part of this profession that is about making a future that's better for everyone, it's such a pleasure to be here addressing you, because that's why you're all in this room. That's why all of us came to this profession. And so it's an honor to be here and to spend time with you, because you're the kind of people that are going to make the world a better place. So what do I want to talk about? First thing I want to talk about is how much time am I spending? So I am going to go back to my clock. Number things I don't want. I just want the clock. There we go. So in a nutshell, this is the message of my book. Kind of what I was just saying, that, you know, we literally are the people that have the responsibility for facing human habitation, for shaping human habitation. And in doing that, we're really compelled to address what I like to think of as the 21st century imperatives that are going to shape our world. And I'll talk about those in quite a bit of detail. What that represents for us, the shapers of the environment, is what I like to think of as a relevance revolution. Think of it that everything that humans do comes through the spaces that we make. the challenges that we're faced with today, which are truly existential challenges that threaten civilization itself, whether we get it right or whether we don't get it right, whether we meet those challenges or not meet those challenges, is going to be because of how we shape the environment that all these things are happening in. It's an incredible responsibility, and it's also an amazing opportunity. To do what we need to do, though, requires a very significant mode shift. We can't keep doing what we've been doing, especially for the last 80 years. We really need to be thinking about not what are the new cool things that are we creating, but how are we going to reintegrate and heal the places that are already here and the people who are already here. So that's what my book's about. So I'm gonna jump into it. I'm gonna go through a lot of things very quickly. If you want to know more, read a book. Oh, read my book, for example. I think it's important to just kind of really show the arc of the lessons that I think are important for us to know going forward. But again, I'm not going to spend a lot of detail on any of it. I want to start, though, by talking about what I consider to be the 3 21st century imperatives. And no matter who's in the White House, no matter what country you're in, no matter what age you are, these are the patterns that are shaping our future for the rest of the century, at least. And I like to think of them as the justice imperative, climate imperative, and urban imperative. And I'm going to say a little bit more about each one. There just happens to have been a United Nations conference about each one of these topics that happened in 2015 and 2016. The first one of those was the Sustainable Development Conference, which is literally the continuation of the Brundtland Commission report from 1987 that literally brought us the term sustainable development. So this was a check-in, where are we on sustainable development as 2030 is really staring at us. And in 2015, 2030 was just 15 years away. And from that came the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I'm sure there's many of you that have heard about the SDGs before. And I would just simply say that think of it almost as sort of a Bill of Rights for the human race. No poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equity, and of course, housing for all. Oops, they left that one out. We weren't at the table, folks. We have to get at the table. Why isn't housing for all in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals? It's because we're not involved enough in these conversations. The second one, which I think probably everybody in this room is aware of, is the Paris Summit on climate change, and establishing the whole idea of what decarbonization is about, the importance of decarbonization to avoid global warming at catastrophic levels. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But I just want to point to the two little factoids on this slide. One is the agreement that we're going to cap global warming at no more than 2 degrees Celsius. In other words, there's a threshold we do not want to cross because we're afraid of what the consequences will be if we cross it. And then the second one is that to prevent that, we have to make the change by 2050. If we're still polluting carbon in everything we do by 2050, we are not going to prevent that global warming threshold from being crossed. I would also just add that I think Christiana Figueres is one of the greatest negotiators and greatest diplomats ever. To make that happen was a miracle. And then the last one is the one that I'm surprised to say most architects have never even heard of, and that is Habitat 3 that took place in Quito, Ecuador in 2013, at which the new urban agenda was adopted. Does anybody think that architects might find the new urban agenda as something that we should pay attention to and that we should know about and we should be operationalizing in everything we do in our practices and everything that we teach in our schools? And the fact that most architects have never even heard of this before is, I think, damning that we're not even aware of these trends that are literally shaping what we do nearly enough. So I just want to end this by saying, okay, 3 UN conferences, that's just a bunch of those overpaid bureaucrats in New York, living off the fat of the land of their countries. Why should we pay attention to them? And I just want you to know that they're not the only ones that are thinking in these terms. And in fact, in 2011, a book was published about the work that Michael Mullen did as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in which he said the sustainability is the greatest threat to our national security. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So this is just not theoretical stuff that a bunch of overpaid bureaucrats are sitting around over a glass of wine talking about in New York City. These are serious issues that affect all of our lives. So who am I? Why should you be listening to me? What is it? I'm a Terp, so you already know I'm a good guy. But beyond that, really, what am I bringing to the table? What are my experiences that make me care about these issues and want to share them? And I actually transferred to the University of Maryland from Pratt Institute. And I started at Pratt Institute in 1967. Yes, I really am as old as dirt. And what was going on in my world then? And I think that this phrase from The Tale of Two Cities really captures it. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. There was excitement and inspiration at every turn. And then there was catastrophic disappointment right around the corner. My 2 favorite heroes were killed. How terrible is that? That was the world that I was introduced to as a teenager going to college. So what was in that? What was packed into that moment? Well, the civil rights movement was probably the most important thing that was going on. It was literally changing our notion about what a good society is. And it was not a smooth path. Picture on the right is from after the riots, which may be more properly called civil disobedience in Washington, D.C. The second was the environmental movement. And I went to the first Earth Day in New York City. I have to say that with this particular one, it was very important to me because it was hope. It just wasn't burdened with some of the things like having Martin Luther King assassinated. It didn't have the downside. It was just all, we can make the world a better place. And that was beginning to happen with some energy. The first Earth Day is the largest civil active action ever in the history of the world. 20 million people participated in the first Earth Day. Nothing even comes close. The historic preservation movement, which turned out to really, really change my career as an architect, was also beginning after an act of urban vandalism with the destruction of Penn Station in New York. And this quote from Vincent Scully, I think, says it all. We entered the city like a god. One scuttles in now like a rat. Architects did that in the name of progress. And then the other thing that was very real in New York City at that time was the battle for the soul of the city between Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses. These 2 highway proposals that you can see diagrams of here were what motivated her to keep her neighborhood from being bulldozed to make way for a highway. I live in a house in Tacoma Park, Maryland, that would have been a highway if it wasn't for people like Jane Jacobs. And then, of course, in the architecture school, there was another revolution happening, which was, the battle for the soul of architecture. And so that was the world that I grew up in. When I was sitting in those chairs in Pratt Institute, not here in Maryland yet, that's what was going on in this world around me. It led me to understand that it is very important for our profession to understand who we are and what we do. I went to Pratt because when I was in high school, my chorus sang at the New Jersey Pavilion like every month. And so I got to run around this amazing 1964, 1965 World's Fair, which was this vision of tomorrow that was just mind-boggling, absolutely mind-boggling. This is actually an image from Futurama. And I just wanted to go to architecture school and I wanted to design the coolest things that you ever saw. And the world I faced is what I just told you about. There was, obviously, that was a little bit of a collision between that reality and this image that I had of, my buildings are going to be gold, in fact, that they're so cool. We actually have a president right now that wants to do this, put everything in gold. But it made me aware that we really do have this double personality, almost a schizophrenic personality, really, of wanting to design cool things, and yet everything we do has human purpose. And it's very hard for us to talk about the human purpose side of what we do. Why? Why isn't that the first thing we talk about? And to some degree we do. We go and we talk to our clients and we want to know if they have children and how many bedrooms they want to have and things like that. But sincerely, how many architecture firms have a purposeful mission that is a social mission in what they're doing? And I want to tell you, as AI president, the answer is a lot of architecture firms. Smith Group is a great, there are a lot of firms that are there that are saying, yes, let's do work that is socially relevant. It's enormously important that we keep that as a driver. And it really it has its roots in the very AIA itself. So in 1957, when Richard Upjohn, who's pictured here, and the 13 other New York architects that got together and created an organization, which a few years later became the American Institute of Architects. Why did they do that? Oh, we want to do really cool stuff and make sure that we're using Corinthian columns in the right place. No, they came together because New York was squalid. It was literally fatal to live in. That New York in 1800 was 30,000 people. By 1860, it was 1 million. Can you imagine what that city looked like? Going from 30,000 to 1 million in 2 generations. It was squalid. It was disease-ridden. It was absolutely a horrible place to be. And the architects of the day said, we have to do something about this. We have to be involved. We have to make our city a healthy, wonderful city. And what did they do? A lot of what happened was infrastructure. We need clean water. We need sewers. We need garbage collection. We need street sweeping. So there's a lot of very, very practical things that were done. But the other things that were done were literally architects saying we need a new generation of buildings. And this has always been one that I found particularly great, that, we're going to go from tenements to elevator buildings. And elevator buildings gave them the opportunity to do taller buildings, and everybody would have light and air, and the rich people at the top would get really great views of Central Park and so on. But architects were very sincere about the importance of light and air in spaces, that we needed to create healthy buildings. It brings us to the most important thing that I know of that's ever been said about architecture. And that is, first we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. Thank you, Winston Churchill. Let's just simply remember that the conditions that we create for human society are there for a long time. And they're going to shape human society for generations and generations and generations. Are we thinking about that mission? Are we actually operationalizing that mission? Are we paying enough attention to that mission? And I just want to say we have a contribution to make. Architects have sensibilities that matter. We have a sense of proportion about the world. We understand when things feel right and when they don't, when they are welcoming and when they're forbidding. We get that. We understand that vocabulary. Our world needs our contribution. And I'll just give you an example of this that's a particular black and white one, which actually I've stolen from James Morrison Fitch, who in his book about the forces that shape architecture. These are some of the best concert halls in the world. They were all built in the late 1800s, and they were all built using the traditions of theater design. Just the conventions of theater design that had been built since literally the Greeks building amphitheaters in the sides of the mountains in Greece. Jordan Hall, Carnegie Hall, the Music Fair in Vienna. A generation later, the worst concert halls that have ever been built were built in the name of acoustic science. I got to renovate a bunch of them at the Kennedy Center. They were terrible. Why? Because the modern science of acoustics had overridden all that tradition. And the science vector was the thing that everybody was supposed to pay attention to now. Now, this building, this hall of Philharmonic Hall in New York was just renovated for the 4th time. It reopened in 2022, I think it was, you know, with the acousticians talking about all the cool modeling they did and everything. If they have a hall that's as good as Carnegie Hall, more power to them. It only took them 60 years to get it right. Okay, so don't be intimidated by the science vector. Science has a role to play in what we do, but we as architects have something to bring to the table. Bring it to the table. It's of value. So where do we go from here? We have some problems to solve, and I want to start with the climate imperative and just talk about that, because the climate imperative just requires the following thing. We have to retool everything about what we do. We have to do it everywhere, and it will affect the lives of everyone. Everything, everywhere, everyone. That's a big job. And what is our choice? Our choice is we can have catastrophic climate change. So that's our job. Let's get at it. What does it look like to do that job? I just want to say that we've known an awful lot about these circumstances for 50 years, and we've done a very, very bad job of implementing them and operationalizing. Most of the climate pollution that we're suffering from today is pollution that happened since these realizations were made. So we're just not listening to the lessons around us. How do we do better than that as architects? Well, the story kind of begins in 1973 with the oil embargo, and all of a sudden architects recognizing energy actually maybe would be a factor in what we're doing. It just happens to be the same year that the AIA headquarters opened their fancy new building, which, by the way, didn't have light switches because turning off the lights would shorten the bulb life of the fluorescent tubes, and the energy was so cheap, don't turn off the lights. So that's the architectural paradigm that existed in 1973 when the oil embargo happened. The other thing that was part of that was everything we were doing was just polluting the world like crazy. And you know what? We haven't much changed that to this day. So that was our world in 1973 when we're going to start to change things. We literally fast forward to 2003 when Ed Mazzaria publishes his now famous article in Metropolis magazine titled Architects Pollute, talking about carbon pollution. And now this thing that's been going on for 30 years, talking about energy efficiency and things like that, now suddenly it's about something very different. It's about global warming. It's about carbon pollution. Now, how do we think about carbon pollution? It's not just about energy efficiency. What does that look like? We know that today, the consequences of global warming are already being felt. They're being felt all around the world. They're being felt in many different ways. So the idea that this maybe could have consequences, it's no longer a maybe. It's having really serious consequences. We really have work to do, and we have to do it quickly. I mentioned the Paris Agreement. I mentioned those two things, capping global warming at 2.0 degrees Celsius, and also the getting it done by 2050. By the way, you see 1.5 here, because the people that were the scientists actually paying attention to global warming were saying 2.0 is too far, man. We got to stop it at 1.5, because the difference between 1.5 and 2 in terms of the climate impacts are very different. So that's why the Eiffel Tower says 1.5 degrees, but the agreement that everybody signed says 2. That's negotiation 101, by the way. So what does this all mean? Why do those numbers matter? And this is the global warming one. This is average global temperature. So this is the history of the average global temperature in the world for the last 500,000 years. So what's happened during that period of time? Well, about half of that time, there has literally been no ice in the world. Okay, it's been too warm. There've been no ice caps, nothing. okay? As the temperatures have dropped and ice has formed, we've actually, you know, got this world that we're familiar with, where we have ice caps and things like that. The Paris Accord talked about this 2.0 degrees Celsius, and you can see that the gap closes about 40% to the iceless world, that going that 2 degrees, you know, it's a big difference. It's not, oh, it's just 2 degrees. It's going to catastrophe pretty significantly. Where are we today? We've gone a third of the way to catastrophe, and we're like, yeah, but that's so inconvenient. We don't really want to change anything. We have serious work to do. What has it got to do with CO2 levels? And these are the map of the CO2 levels for the last 800,000 years. And during this period of time, there's been a lot of fluctuation. You can see it going up and down between 200 and 300 parts per million. Doesn't sound like much. But during that period of time, we've had 8 ice ages. That fluctuation has been enough for us to have ice ages. Not like it got cold this month. We've had ice ages because of that fluctuation. Well, where are we? Well, our period of civilization was about 60 parts per million north of the ice age line. Today, where are we? Today, we're more than double that amount from the temperate climate conditions that exist, that allowed civilization to exist. So we are playing with fire, literally, and we're way behind the curve. So the building sector, us, what can we do? What are we doing? The Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction is the UN, kind of semi-official UN organization created to talk about building sector issues and to measure things and really understand where we are. Again, Global ABC, every student in this room, know what Global ABC is, know what's in these reports. This is talking about what your job is in the future. Well, what is it telling us? The first thing it's telling us is that the building sector is a big contributor to the problem. And in fact, if you take both the operational emissions and the embodied emissions that are associated with the building sector, we're the biggest part of the problem. And I'll get into that in a little bit of detail. What we're talking about with carbon pollution is what's called scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And just to understand that this was brought about in the industrial sector. These were terms that were made for making products that were being shipped to customers, you know, to buy. Okay, so the language doesn't really quite fit what we do very well, a little bit of a misfit. So we've actually sort of changed the definitions of scope 1, 2, and 3. So scope 1, kind of still clearly the same. It's what's happening in your building. Are you consuming fossil fuels in your building, and what are you consuming for? Most of the carbon pollution is coming from fossil fuel consumption. If you have an all-electric building, the answer to that is none. There is no direct emissions in your buildings. Scope 2, indirect emissions of a certain category, and that is the energy you're consuming for your operations. What is the energy you're consuming? Today in the United States of America, about 2/3 of that energy is being produced by carbon polluting sources, coal, natural gas, and a little bit of oil. So about 2/3 of the energy in most of the places where you are in the United States of America, you are polluting just by turning on the switch. You're also polluting by plugging in your car, I might add, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And then the third is what we call embodied emissions. I have to tell you that Lloyd Alter talks about how wrong this term is. And Lloyd's right. It's actually, the carbon is not in those, you can't find it in those materials we made our buildings out of. The carbon has already been polluted into the atmosphere by making those materials. So in that sense, it's embodied in the materials, but it's not really in there. It's associated with the making of the building and the making of the materials that the building's made out of. So that's it. Those are the 3 things that we have to track. What do we have to do? We have to do these 5 things. The first one is easy. Stop using fossil fuels in your building. Everything about how buildings are operated has an electric version of it, which is in the market, practical, many of them far better products, et cetera. All electric buildings are not a threat to your clients and your occupants. It's just a better way of doing business. And then the other 4 things we need to do actually take a little more work. Envelope performance, systems efficiency, embodied greenhouse gases in the materials that we're using, and then of course the incorporation of renewable energy. I'm not going to get into these in any detail at all, but in your thinking about your buildings, what are you thinking about in terms of envelope performance? And I just will say, this does not mean that every building needs to be passive house. I'm actually in a world that some other time I'll spend you an hour telling you why passive house is not the solution. Not today. Systems efficiency. What are we doing to make our energy use come last instead of coming first? Which in 1973 was the language. How do we not use energy was what everybody was trying to do in 1973. How do we not pollute carbon needs to be our mantra now. And then with the embodied emissions, one thing that a lot of people sort of struggle with is that this is actually big, that the embodied emissions in a typical building are at least about 20 years worth of operational emissions in a typical building. And I'll just make the observation that as we get our buildings more and more energy efficient and have fewer and fewer carbon emissions and actually bring them to zero, the only issue becomes embodied emissions. So we need to pay way more attention to embodied emissions than we are now. And of course, we have choices of what materials we use, and the embodied emission footprint of them really varies quite a lot. And that's another thing I could come back and talk about for an hour, but we're not going to do it today. Excuse me a sec. So architectural solar is the last one, and I just want to simply say that there are many ways of including solar into buildings. Solar panels on the roof is not the only one, even though it seems to be the only one we know of. It's actually one of about, I think it's about 8 different categories of architectural solar. We have a lot of buildings like the New York Times building that's shown here in this photo that have huge wall surfaces. Why aren't we using those wall surfaces for solar collectors when we have a little tiny roof and a big giant wall? And I'm happy to say that the American Institute of Architects renovated headquarters building includes building integrated photovoltaics as part of the shading system of the building. It can be done. And all of this, I just want to simply say at the bottom line here is our codes today are pretty good. Build to code, maybe even build a little better to code. Electrify your buildings, put renewables in your buildings every way you can. And then let's start to talk about zeroing out embodied carbon, because that's the real challenge for us. So we can do this. That's doable. I haven't talked about anything that we can't do or isn't being done. I said at the start, though, that we need to really be doing a mode shift. And the way that I like to talk about the mode shift is that we need to be thinking beyond modern. And what do I mean by that? And I'm going to spend a minute talking about that. The first is to understand our modern era bias. The Biden administration, number one thing that they funded in the 2022 climate bill was electric vehicles. A city that is gridlocked with electric vehicles is not a solution. It is still a city gridlocked with vehicles. It's not a city for people. So we have to understand what the real value of these solutions are and not just accept what Elon Musk wants us to do. We have to be more insistent on getting answers that are real answers that do real good. And there is modern era bias in everything we do. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our modern bias in architecture. The first part of it is for us to recognize that cities are not bad things. Cities are the root of all human progress. They created this environment in which people had the opportunity to exchange and cooperate. From that, productivity resulted and efficiency resulted. That's it, man. Let's everybody in the room learn the lesson of this slide And the next time you're in a conversation, you go, oh, whoa, wait a minute. Cities are the solution. They're not the problem. Let's make our cities the right cities. But it's not avoiding the cities. It's making the right cities. And when the Industrial Revolution happened, this first generation of architects that had elevators, that had steel, that had industrial production, et cetera, that had trolley cars and subways, et cetera, what did they build? They were reformers. They believed that cities could be the solution. And what did they build? They built a movement that became known as the City Beautiful movement. They were urban reformers. The next generation of modernists that wanted to bring about Modern City 2.0, they completely rejected that. They were urban rejectionists. They didn't believe in the power of cities to be the solution for human habitation. Corbu literally wanted to, bulldoze the first and second arrondissements and build 60-story towers. And Frank Lloyd Wright wanted us to fly around in little space cars right here in this picture and live in Broadacre City, saying that suburbanization is obviously the solution. So these were not urban reformers. They were urban rejectionists. Where are we today? The two smartest cities in the world that look in the mirror and go, oh man, am I smart? I'm New York. I am smart. I'm Paris. These two cities, this is what they're going to do. Regions of sugar plums. New York City is going to tear down 50-story buildings and build 100-story buildings. And Paris is going to build these things that have windmills in them or whatever. At least Vincent Cayabo is thinking maybe the only solution is not a glass building. But seriously, this is the future. This is modern era bias so dense that we will never get anywhere until we kick the can right off the sidewalk. We know what it means to build cities for people. We also know what it means to build cities for banks so they can maximize their return. Which one is it? Which one are we going to pay attention to? Which one are we going to become part of? So I just have to throw this in. Executive Order 14344. I talked about beyond modern. There are people talking about beyond modern around the world today. Some of them are talking about it in a way that I'm not particularly in agreement with. Are we going to become part of this conversation? Or are we just going to say, oh, those are those stupid people, so we're not going to pay attention to it? What is our narrative that's more compelling than this narrative? I mean, read 14344. The narrative in it is very compelling. Okay, you don't have to agree with what it's saying, that the architectural solution is, but what's our narrative that's more compelling than this? So I want to give you a little bit of that narrative from my world, and that is having mid-career become a historic preservation architect. And that gave me the opportunity to do two things. One is I got to actually work in older buildings. And I went into that as the director of sustainability for Quinn Evans. I was going to green those bad old buildings. And after about 10 years or so, I started going, which one's the bad building again? Wait a minute. There's a lot of value in these old buildings. There's a lot of lessons in these old buildings that maybe we should actually pay attention to them and see what they're trying to tell us. This book title, by the way, If the Past Teaches, What Does the Future Learn? Says it in a nutshell, and it's archaeologists trying to say, how can we be part of the climate solution? But what does that look like? What are the lessons that 6,000 years of built heritage is trying to teach us? If we were designing airplanes, we could go back to 1903 and the Wright brothers. We would have 120 plus years of history to draw on. We are architects. We have 6,000 years of buildings and cities to look at that are all over the world, that are in every climate, that are produced by every culture. They are an encyclopedia of how to live on this world that we need to pay attention to. And we don't. We don't pay nearly enough attention to it. So performance follows form. What do I mean by that? And I'm sure many of you know this anecdote of Bill McDonough tells about Ralph Waldo Emerson, going to Europe in a clipper ship, coming back in a steamship, and instead of having sailors yo-ho-hoing up in the sails and the masts, there were people shoveling coal into a furnace, sweating in the bowels of the ship. So are we designing rust buckets? Are we designing sailboats that know how to sail through the climate and the weather and really have people be comfortable in that sailing mode? And, some early modernists got this. We all know Buckminster Fuller for how much does your building weigh, but another thing that he talked about was energy slaves. He was a little psychotic, he was kind of on the edge. He was certainly on the spectrum or something, but, so he saw the energy slaves. He saw them. He didn't imagine, he saw them. They were all around him. He couldn't sleep at night because the energy slaves that he saw. Energy is not the solution that design and operability can provide us. So let's not go to energy until we figured out what design and operability can give us instead. And again, our 6,000 years of built heritage teach us this. That really, these are buildings that show us what it means to be climate adapted and to work in a climate. This is a building designed by a Philadelphia architect for a client in Natchez, Mississippi. He goes to Natchez, and this is very personal to me. I went from New York to Memphis, and it's like, oh my God, people live here? People actually live in this climate? What's wrong with them? So, I can actually design a building that works. And actually seeing the buildings that were designed that worked in Memphis was what actually got me interested in this my very first job in architecture. Fortunately, there are architects that are understanding this. And this is a building right here in Washington, D.C. by Rick Snyder and iStudio, where they did their field investigation of the historic school, and they noticed that all of the classrooms had shafts that went up to the attic. Why have a shaft that goes up to the attic? The boiler's in the basement. And they discovered that in the attic, there was a cupola. And the cupola was actually drawing air out of the attic. And it was an induced ventilation system that was literally pulling air in through the classrooms, out through the attic and out through the cupola. So what did they do? They emulated it in their design, and they created these solar chimneys. And they also, by the way, shaded the building according to the orientation of the wall. So we can do this. Just want to say one more thing about this, and that is, our ideas of how we're designing for climate now, our use of psychrometric charts and so on. This is the work of the Olgay brothers. They taught at Princeton for many years. They had 5 factors that they considered in trying to determine human comfort. Our psychrometric charts have 2. Temperature, humidity, that's it. We don't even have radiation, which is the #1 way that our body gains or loses temperature. So again, back to the science of Kennedy Center and Lincoln Center. How good is the science we're using to design our buildings around? It's like, okay, we're going to have 1 temperature on 1 thermostat, and we're going to operate the building 365 days a year on that. That is ridiculous. That's lazy and stupid. We can do better than lazy and stupid. And I really recommend that you look up the work of Susan Roth and the other people that contribute to adaptive thermal comfort, also contribute to the Comfort at the Extremes conference. This is the wind catchers in Yazd, Iran. People lived there for thousands of years without air conditioning. How did they do it? Let's figure it out. The second thing I want to talk about is, the Carl statement, the greenest building is one that's already built, and our tendency to devalue buildings very quickly and just massively. And, I don't actually really know how to do anything. I just know how to wave my hands around and talk about it. But the people that actually do know how to do something did a study of that statement and found that, yes, keeping existing buildings is actually provably environmentally a better way to go by far most of the time. At Quinn Evans, these are some of our, beautifully restored buildings. You look at these buildings and you go, of course they were restored. They're so beautiful. They're so cool. They're in such great locations or whatever. 3 of those 4 buildings were threatened with demolition. I didn't renovate buildings. I rescued buildings. I rescued them from becoming part of the landfill. The landfill in the United States of America is only 1/2 by tonnage of the construction and demolition worth. Let me say that the other way around. Construction and demolition by tonnage is twice what all the municipal waste in this country is annually. We throw out 800,000 buildings a year. It's wastefulness on a scale that's criminal, just criminal. Fortunately, we're beginning to understand that building reuse is in fact design. And I love Liliane Wong's work because it starts with obsolescence. It starts with saying, we have to rescue the buildings that we now understand are obsolete. The power plant that's not being used anymore. Actually, the shopping mall that's not being used anymore. The empty office buildings in Washington, D.C. that aren't being used anymore. So it starts with this sense of obsolescence. Then what are the reuse challenges? What are the reuse opportunities? And we're beginning to actually see this get into the, covers of magazines and the things like the Pritzker Prize. So I'm encouraged that we're beginning to understand that. I do want to pop a little bit of a balloon into a lot of the things that we talk about with things like circularity, which again are industrial level ideas that have quite a bit of validity in some industrial level stuff. Even I have to say that I think technical cycle is a bit of a misnomer, and it only really works with one category of materials, minerals. But what are we building our buildings out of? What is our definition of good technology today? And I just want to use the example of 2 New York City icons. The 20th century icon at the Empire State Building and the 21st century icon of the Freedom Tower at the World Trade Center site. So the Empire State Building and Freedom Tower are both LEED Gold buildings. When the Empire State Building was renovated about 15 years ago, the windows were popped out. They're all the same size. They were taken to an empty floor in the building. They were reconditioned. They were put back in. The other 2/3 of the building is made out of a material called stone. You may have heard of it. And what they had to do to restore that material was, wait for it, they had to wash it. And the only reason they had to wash it was because they didn't think it was patina. Patina is what we call dirt that we like. Okay? So that's what had to be done to make that wall renewed for another generation. So what will be the case when Freedom Tower is ready for its whole building renovation that the Empire State Building just went through? The entire facade is going to be disassembled and thrown into the landfill because it's not recyclable. It can't be disassembled and reused. None of the components are reusable in any way, shape, or form. You read about the recycling of the glass and so on. There are some things like, oh yeah, we can crush the glass up and use it as an aggregate in concrete. That is not recycling, that's downcycling, that's taking a highly valuable material and making it junk and saying that we've reused it. So which one of these is a more sustainable way of building? Is our 21st century example really better than the 20th century example? It is not. This is not sustainable technology. We need to understand building life cycle. And thank you to Stuart Brandt for, I hope that every student in this room reads his book, How Buildings Learn. But from the carbon standpoint, the reason why this is so important is that there's a real coincidence between heavy construction and carbon footprint. So 2/3 of our buildings roughly are made out of these enormously heavy industrial materials, steel and concrete particularly, that literally last forever. They last forever if we just simply use them well. And again, we just throw this carbon out like there's no tomorrow. And I'll just say one more thing, and that is our building codes tell us that we have to build these very, 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 very durable buildings. They have to be fireproof, they have to be earthquake proof, they have to be storm proof, they have to be bomb proof. And yet there's not a word in the code that says, since you're building a building that has a structural frame that will last for 500 years, here are our guidelines for how to make that an investment that will have value for 500 years. We build buildings that are so weird that no one can reuse them, instead of buildings that are so ordinary that anybody could reuse them. And our codes could talk about that. So I'll just give you an example of that. This is a typical Washington building, mid-century renewal building. In fact, this is where Quinn Evans' offices is right to this very day. So the 1980 building, they stripped it down to the concrete frame. They put up new curtain wall and everything. Oh my gosh, what a wasteful thing to do, blah, 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 blah. Believe it or not, I'm here to defend this because they kept something. They kept the frame. They kept 60% of the carbon pollution of this building. And I'll just give you a real nuts and bolts on what does this look like. So here's a project that we did in Detroit that's similar. Here's the carbon footprint of the skin, 368 tons, of the stuff that we needed to do to make it go from an office building to apartments, another 920 tons. And then we kept the structural frame valued at 1,932 tons. So what does that look like from a holistic carbon footprint viewpoint? Well, the first thing is, what are we comparing it to? What's the baseline? The baseline is the building that was there belching out carbon before. So we're going to do something to improve that, right? That's what we do as architects. So what do? Well, we spend a little embodied carbon on the skin. We spend a little more on the space plan to make it apartment instead of office. And then we start consuming energy and polluting carbon less because we now have a better building. So we actually get a net avoided emissions result from doing that work. Now, what happens if we tear that building down and replace it with a new building? Well, we have to buy that structure. Now what happens when we start consuming operational emissions? Now how much have we saved? We've saved nothing. Now I have a test question for you. Which one of those is the better one? So we just have to understand the facts, the actual outcome of what we're doing. There is plenty of design opportunity here. These are just three of my favorite examples of Lever House, which is a restored historic building, Celebrezzi building, where they literally reclad the building, overclad the building with a second facade, and then the Green Wyatt Federal building, where they replaced the facade like I showed you on those previous buildings. But they did this, wait for this one. They designed the facade to respond to its solar orientation. I know that's a difficult concept. I'm going to say it again. They designed the facade for its solar orientation. As a result, about a third of the carbon reduction was a result of that facade design. Almost no cost, just do a different facade design and reduce the amount of load that the building is dealing with. Why is this important? It's important because most of what you are going to do, students in the room, is you're going to be dealing with the post-World War II building stock. You are going to make more fee renovating those buildings than you are going to make designing new buildings. Now that's a reality. I hope that doesn't shatter you too much, but that's a reality of what's happening with real estate economics. The other part of that is don't believe the bunk you hear about growth. Our population is flat. It's been flat for 30 years. The only thing that has made our population grow in the United States of America for the last 30 years is a thing called immigration, which we now don't allow. So our population is flat. Why do we need to double the building stock in the next 30 or 40 years? Okay, we just don't. When I was born, the typical house was 900 square feet. The typical family was 3.9 people. Today, the typical house is 2,400 square feet, and the typical family is 2.3 people. So we have a whole person plus less, and we have 3 times more house. So we need to double the building stock in the next 40 years. Will somebody please explain that to me? I'm missing it. I am missing it. Let's use the buildings we have, for heaven's sake. Permanence, architecture's superpower. And if I learned anything from dealing with old buildings, this is what I learned. This is the #1 lesson. Buildings last, again, wait for it one more time, forever. Measured in human lives, they last forever. They last for thousands of years. Not even Methuselah lasted for 1,000 years. This on the right is a city in Yemen, who, by the way, we bombed today. That is a 1,000-year-old city made out of adobe. We don't have to make these, recycling. How about buildings that are made out of earth from a mile away from your building, the building that lasts for 1,000 years? How's that for a life cycle of building? Jane Jacobs understood this in terms of the economics of affordability, and that affordability in older buildings are totally joined at the hip. The idea of building affordable housing is an oxymoron. The reality of what it means to renovate versus what it means to build new, highly crafted people need to do work that requires real skill sets to renovate an existing building. The money goes to their paychecks, it stays in the community. The amount of energy that's consumed is way lower. The amount of materials that is consumed way lower. Building reuse and renewal is by far a better way to go, and we have the greenest building study to prove it. 20 years ago, Storm Cunningham wrote this book, The Restoration Economy, talking about how we've made such a mess of every aspect of the environment and the soil, et cetera, of all, I think it was 13 economic sectors that he looked at, that every one of them is actually at a tipping point now where restoration activities are more important than new activities. And again, how much of this are we really paying attention to? What do our cities need? Really starting at about the time of the Wilson administration, we have been intentionally disintegrating our city, intentionally separating rich people from poor people, brown people from white people. It went right up through the 60s with the development of zoning, and these redlining maps are from the 50s. It's not some, oh yeah, they did this at the Civil War. They did this when your parents were children. They did this when I was a child. And healing our cities, it's not rocket science. We need to make places for people to live and to be neighborly with each other. So I'm just going to end very quickly by saying that the key to so much of this is reconnecting with our impacts. Do we really, really understand what the impact of our work is? And right now, the answer is no, we're still addicted to toxic fuels. We're polluting the air, the land, the sea, even below the earth to get our hands on toxins that are explosive, that are flammable, and that are poisonous. And then we pipe them into all our buildings. How crazy is that for a paradigm? The alternatives are unbelievably interesting and cool and clean and efficient. By far the cheapest energy, and I wish the current administration would remember this, is solar power and wind power, by far the cheapest. Same thing with understanding our role, our agency in construction workforce. And so construction workforce abuse is not a theory. It happens even in this country. A lot of this has been associated with undocumented workforce issues. But because of that, all of the construction associations have for 30 years been asking Congress to give us a sensible, workable immigration law system. And we haven't done anything about it. So obviously the right solution is just throw them all out, throw the rascals out. This is, I really hope that you look at the work that Sharon Prince is doing at Grace Farms and understand that our global supply chains are dirty. There's not a global supply chain in the world that isn't dirty, that doesn't have forced labor, child labor, and even human trafficking behind it. In fact, the most common everyday things, the worst one of all these is timber. The chances are if you're using a special timber like a mahogany or something like that, there were children standing at gunpoint involved in harvesting those materials. Look at the work of Great Swan. We should be paying attention to this. And I just want to end this by saying, how come we're so bad talking about the great stuff we do? I got to meet Carlos Moreno last year. He's awesome. I love him. I just threw my arms around him. He's such a fantastic guy. His book, he so totally gets it. Why is it called The 15-Minute City? What the hell is that? Does anybody care what a 15-minute city is? His book is called Living Together in Harmony. Why can't we talk about living together in harmony? We have to talk about 15-minute cities? I mean, come on, folks. Let's talk about something that sounds like it matters. We are at a point where the world has shrunk. 2 droughts created a migrant crisis in Syria, another migrant crisis in Central America. 6 million people left Syria. 1 million of them ended up in Europe. It completely changed the political map in Europe. It made, completely changed. I'll leave it at that. 2 million people fled Central America, came to our borders. It completely changed the political map here. The Biden administration did a study in 2023 that estimates by 2050, there will be 140 million climate refugees. Do you have any idea what that's going to look like when 8 million just disrupted the politics of Europe and North America? Do you have any idea what that's going to be like? We have to be thinking about the whole human race. We can't be thinking about how do we take care of us. We can't build walls that are thick enough or high enough or strong enough to protect us from that world. We have to be thinking about everyone, everywhere, everything. When I was a child, this person became president, and he was concerned about a threat to human civilization called weapons of mass destruction. And he was concerned that they were going to wipe out human civilization. And within 2 years, he was almost proved right by the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the United States and the Soviet Union almost came to blows with each other. What did he say about facing that challenge? He said, I welcome it. We have to welcome this challenge. This is about our relevance revolution. It's about moving to the next mode of practice, which will be a better, more fulfilling way to show us how to live in harmony and live on the earth within the earth's limits. Let's get to work on it. It is our future. It is an inspiring future. And I'm so happy to be in a room full of people who wake up every morning wanting to make the world a better place. Let's do it together. Thank you.
So much. Thank you, Carl, so much. We are up against time. We do have time, I think, for about 2 questions. Unfortunately, Carl's going to be available in the great space to chat some more with us. See a question over here.
Thank you for the talk. Very enlightening. Question regarding architects and agency and what we can do to influence this, because so much of the time in our careers, we are actually not the decider of the program or the spec, right? The other piece, like you mentioned, is banks and by extension, developers. What are opportunities for architects to bridge that gap to give us more agency in shaping what actually gets built instead of being the last person to the table?
Yeah, I think there's 2 things that we really ought to pay attention to. The first one is model the behavior, live well, live in that 15-minute city that shows us how to live in harmony together and to have the things that you need just a short walk away. Live that way. Show the benefit of what that looks like. Okay, that's the most important thing you can do. The other thing you can do is have the conversation. In the real estate world, it's all about what somebody does with their piece of property. But what gave that piece of property value? Well, first, the public sector invested trillions of dollars into making the infrastructure, the street grid, subdividing the land, zoning the land, planning the land, et cetera. Then every single neighbor of that piece of property built their building. The reason why that person that you're working with as a client has a program for a project is because of the collective action of all those other people. Ask your client, do you recognize the collective action that brought you the value that you have on this property? Are you prepared to understand your role in the collective action going forward? Because that's really the question. There's when you ask that question, there are many interesting answers that you get from that.
Hi. Unfortunately, as designers or architects or students, we're under the mercy of whoever the client is. And most of those times, whether it's a government or a client, they don't really care about the environment that much. So how can you build something that fulfill the egos of having something that very nice and very modern or very big, but also contribute to the greater good of the environment?
So when was the last time you had a client say, I really want to look at your energy model and make sure they're using the right variable? So they don't care about it. So then don't talk about it. Do it. There's a million examples that are like that I could give. But, we know what better practice looks like. Do it. Oh, I'm not making enough money. Charge higher fees.
Thank you again for incredibly illuminating conversation, an important one as well. And we're looking forward to continuing that conversation in the great space. So thank you so much, and we'll see you all out there.
Yeah, he died.
Oh, you're on.